Hello, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with my Week 5 comment response video. If you'll recall, last week in class we learned about the new tradition of courtly love that emerged in Western Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries. As we saw, courtly love was a kind of counter-doctrine because it ran counter to the official sexual ideology of the Christian Church, which held that all sexual desire was sinful. Rejecting this argument, the troubadours and troubarites who sang of true love argued that when tempered by selfless devotion to one's partner, sexual desire was actually quite pure, innocent, and holy. As this new love doctrine spread, poets and writers began penning romance narratives full of characters who, through great acts of heroic suffering, successfully mastered their sexual appetites and won the objects of their heart's desire. Upon consummating a relationship with their beloved, physical love in these stories is transformed into spiritual ecstasy, something that God blesses and rewards. In last week's discussion, one of the questions that I asked us to think about was how far this ideal of courtly love spread outside Europe's borders. Is this a Western-specific, historically limited way of understanding the relationship between sexual desire and love, or is it similar to the way that these two things have been conceptualized in other times and places, including the present? From our conversations, it's clear that opinions vary. Some of us drew parallels between the romantic love complex articulated in medieval European literature and those seen in contemporary Turkish TV dramas or in some of the movies produced by the Kazakhstani film industry. Others, however, were skeptical, and they argued that the idea of true love probably never moved outside of Europe's borders, and that probably even there it is dead today. These are all really interesting insights, and as they suggest, thinking and talking about love is hard. It's especially difficult when we're asking how ideas about love might vary from one place to another, or from one time to another. Whether we're thinking about love in terms of our own lives or in an academic sense, love is truly a messy thing. So in the hopes of providing a bit more clarity on the questions we debated last week, in this video I want to take us to yet another place, which is Japan. Specifically, I want to look at how the new sexual roles and rules being created in Europe during the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries compare to those that existed in Japan during the same exact time. When we make this comparison, we'll see that the distinction between European sexual appetite and true love were quite unique. That is to say, these distinctions were not made in other places. The understanding of sexual relationships and love that operated in medieval Japan was, in fact, quite different because here, lust and true love were not separated. As evidence of this, I'd like to turn to the literature of the medieval Japanese court. In Japanese history, the period between 794 and 1185 AD is known as the Heian Period. The word Heian literally means peaceful peace, and the Heian Period is so named in part because the capital city during these centuries was in Heian-kyo, which is modern-day Kyoto. The Heian Period was one in which aristocrats, most notably the Fujiwara clan, wielded considerable political and economic power. It was also a period of great cultural flowering, especially in the arts, poetry, and literature. Among other things, the Heian period gave us one of Japan's most classic and well-read pieces of literature, the Tale of Genji, which was written somewhere between 1000 and 1012 by Murasaki Shikibu. Murasaki was one among a handful of ladies-in-waiting at the imperial court who turned their hands to writing, composing poems, memoirs, and novels that achieved great popularity within aristocratic circles. Other literary classics of this period include the Izumi Shikibu Nikki, which is a diary that recounts and defends the author Izumi Shikibu in her relationship with Prince Atsumichi. This was written from 1003 to 1004. And another key text, the Kagero Nikki, which is often translated as the Gossamer Years. This is also a diary. It is a diary of an anonymous woman who was the second wife of Fujiwara no Kaneiie, a high-ranking aristocrat, and it was written somewhere around 974 AD. In addition to these writings, it bears note that lovers in the Heian court frequently sent each other personalized poems, particularly those of the waka genre, which consist of 5 lines and 31 syllables. Taken together, these writings tell us quite a lot about life in the imperial capital, and in particular about the Heian court's sexual rules, norms, and scripts. But before getting into these writings, I want to talk just a little bit about the broader political and social context in which the Heian court functioned. As in medieval Europe, medieval Japan was a place where religious authorities had a good deal of influence, but instead of Christianity, here in Japan the dominant religion was Buddhism, and Buddhist clerics had a fair amount to say about sex and sexual desire. However, in sharp contrast to European church authorities, Buddhist authorities spent very little, almost no time, trying to regulate people's sexual activities. Sexual desire was not condemned as dangerous or sinful, and prostitutes, secondary wives, and concubines experienced none of the condemnation, shaming, or loss of social position that they did in Western Europe. Moreover, whereas the troubadours drew a distinction between sinful lust, on the one hand, and holy love, on the other, Buddhist writers tended to believe that all sexual relationships were, in the end, doomed to failure. That is not a surprising thing to say, as Buddhists generally believe that all human endeavors were tragic, things that ended only in frustration and loss. So for them, there was no distinction between emotional longings and physical appetites. The negative effects of sexual relationships for Buddhists had nothing to do with unfaithfulness or overindulgence or other things that troubadours complained about. Instead, they had to do with the broader problem of impermanence. We can see the influence of some of these ideas in waka poetry, which emphasize themes of longing and loss and often inescapable sadness. As an example of this genre, consider a waka poem from a 9th century imperial anthology called the Kokinshu, which contains just over 1,100 poems. This one is by a well-known writer known as Lady Ise, and it reads as follows. My tears, too, stream down in concert with the passing showers. In my old hometown, the color of the autumn leaves takes on a deeper shade. So too do these themes predominate in the Gossamer Years, which, as I said, is a memoir composed by an unknown woman who was the second wife of Fujiwara no Kaneiie. In the text, this woman is identified only as Michitsuna's mother, in reference to the son she bore Kaneiie. The memoir makes quite clear that Kaneiie was involved in at least 8 sexual relationships, 3 of which were marriages, and the text also demonstrates that the author bore quite a lot of resentment toward her husband, who is repeatedly accused of neglecting her and is also criticized for making the author feel alone, betrayed, and just generally full of anguish. In one particularly sad chapter, Michitsuna's mother falls into despair after hearing that her husband was carrying on an affair with a lowly woman in a back alley. When Kanaie then brings this woman into his main residence to live there, she is appalled and offended. So you can get a sense of her feelings, let me share this passage from the memoir with you, in which the author finds fault with Kanaie's behavior. She says, "He pretended that there was nothing unnatural about his behavior, nothing at which I could take offense. But I found his glibness quite distasteful, and wished that he had the courtesy to hide his new affair somewhat more cleverly, perhaps to keep it out of sight for a while, as he could have very easily done under the cloak of court business." There are a couple of interesting things about this passage. First, note that Michitsuna's mother is not mad about the affair itself. She's not lodging a complaint against extramarital sex or her husband's adultery. She's not attempting to hold her husband to this European standard of true love. She's not arguing that his sexual transgressions suggest that he has behaved sinfully and is incapable of monogamy. In this passage, there's no contrast between appetite and the demands of true love. Instead, the author is angry because Kanaie brought this woman into his home where everyone could see. It is his glibness she finds fault with, his lack of courtesy and discretion. Had Kanaie hid the affair, she probably wouldn't have despaired over it at all. While this is just a single passage from a single text, it is representative of Heian conceptions of sex more generally. In complete contrast with the situation in Europe, in medieval Japan, there was no dichotomy of the heart and the libido. There was no division between seductive attractiveness that inspired lust and beauty that inspired devotion and true love. Love was not treated as a highly virtuous state that required acts of heroism. People did not demonstrate it through self-denial or try to prove it by contrasting it with lust. In a world where all desire was frustrating, what Heian lovers gave each other was not fidelity or exclusivity or heroism, but other things: longing, compassion, and shared sadness. The absence of a distinction between appetite and selfless devotion can also be seen by looking at the Heian vocabulary of love. Instead of having separate words for lust and love, in medieval Japan, there was just one word, ski, which could be modified so as to talk about a variety of different things. For example, skiwaza referred to sex acts, skigotu to love affairs or casual liaisons, and skigokochi to feelings of love. None of these words had negative connotations, and the closest we can get to an actual insult here is skizukishi, which can be roughly translated as promiscuous. However, this was not a term applied to people who had lots of affairs. Instead, it was used to describe people who mismanaged these affairs, that is, people who failed to respect their partners in a manner in keeping with their social rank. Members of the Heian court believed that people could have as many lovers as they wanted, so long as that these were treated with tact, courtesy, and the requisite level of respect. When people failed in their sexual relationships, they did not do so because they were promiscuous, but because they failed to keep their relationships within the bounds of discretion. All right, I'm going to leave it there for now. There's so much more that can be said on this topic, so if you're looking for more information, please do let me know, and I'll try to put you in touch with some good readings. Otherwise, I'll see you all back in our virtual classroom real soon. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and to continuing our conversations. Goodbye for now, everyone. Please stay safe and be well.